One mistake, one moment of misjudgment, and just like that, her entire world turned upside down. What if the stranger you dismissed as unimportant turned out to be the most powerful person in the room? For Evelyn, that nightmare became reality when she snapped at a man she thought was a cafe worker, only to later discover he was the CEO of her company. This is a story of misunderstandings, unexpected twists, and the kind of second chances that change everything. Buckle up, because this is one story you won't want to miss. The city pulsed with life, a restless machine of movement and noise. But for Evelyn Carter, the morning felt like one long, unrelenting disaster. Her alarm had failed her, its shrill cry silenced by a sleepy, misguided slap of her hand. What should have been a calm, routine start to the day had instead become a frantic scramble. She had thrown on a crisp white blouse, only for it to be ruined within seconds, courtesy of her unreliable coffee maker. Dark brown stains splattered across the fabric, soaking in like ink bleeding onto a page. There was no time to change. Her commute was no better. The subway was packed beyond reason, the air thick with the stale scent of too many bodies pressed together in a metal capsule. A businessman jabbed at his phone furiously, muttering under his breath. A woman with a stroller struggled to navigate through the tangle of commuters. Somewhere behind her, a teenager was blasting music through cheap earbuds, the tinny sound drilling into her already frayed nerves. And when she finally stumbled out onto the pavement, Evelyn felt as though she had been spat out by the city itself, disheveled, exhausted, and dangerously close to losing what little patience she had left. She was late. The sharp click, click, click of her heels echoed through the towering glass lobby of Kingston and Company, the investment firm where she worked. Employees moved through the space with the ease of well-oiled machines, pressed suits, efficient strides, voices low but purposeful. Everyone belonged. Evelyn, however, felt out of sync, like a song playing 2 beats too fast. Her meeting was in less than 20 minutes. If she could just get one strong espresso, maybe she could salvage the rest of the day. She turned into the company cafe, already scanning for the barista. Empty counter. Her frustration flared, tightening in her chest like a coil ready to snap. Where was the staff? Then, her gaze landed on a man near the espresso machine. He stood with an air of quiet detachment, his hands tucked into the pockets of a black hoodie, a stark contrast to the suits and ties surrounding him. Dark jeans, casual sneakers, a presence that seemed at odds with the sleek, high-end aesthetic of the office space. A new hire, perhaps. A trainee barista? There was no time to question it. Evelyn moved toward him, swift and decisive, her heels striking the marble floor like the ticking hand of a clock. Without hesitation, she gestured toward the espresso machine. Double espresso. No sugar. Extra foam. The man didn't move. A beat of silence, then a slight tilt of his head, as if amused by something she couldn't see. His gaze held hers, unreadable, calm. Too calm. Annoyance flickered through her like a struck match. Was he slow? New? Just standing there for fun? Evelyn exhaled sharply, her hand diving into her purse, fingers brushing against a few crumpled bills. She pulled them out and pressed them into his palm, the movement quick, efficient. A transaction, nothing more. His fingers barely curled around the money. Still, he didn't move, didn't react. Her patience wore thin. If he wasn't cut out for the job, that wasn't her problem. With a curt nod toward the machine, she turned on her heel and walked away, already calculating how much time she had left before her meeting. She didn't see it. Didn't catch the stillness that settled over the cafe, the way the employees at the nearby tables had gone rigid. Didn't notice the way hushed whispers broke out in rapid succession. The stolen glances between co-workers, the flash of a phone camera capturing the moment. And she most definitely didn't see the man standing behind her, watching her departure with something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't quite anger either. Had she looked back, she might have noticed the slow, deliberate way he tucked the money into his pocket, untouched. She might have seen the slight smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, and she would have recognized the way every single person in that café knew him. Because the man she had just mistaken for a café worker, the one she had briskly given orders to, was not an employee. He was Jonathan Reeves, the CEO of the company. And Evelyn Carter had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The executive boardroom was a sanctuary of power, where every seat carried weight, and every person present held influence. The air was crisp, conditioned to the perfect temperature, but Evelyn felt stifled. The sleek, modern design of the room, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the city skyline, the polished mahogany table stretching like a river of authority, should have inspired confidence. Instead, it felt like a trap. She had barely regained her composure from the morning's disasters. Her pulse was still unsteady, a dull throb pressing at her temples. She clutched her notebook tightly, forcing herself to breathe in measured intervals. This meeting was important, more than important, critical. If she wanted to move up in the company, she had to prove she belonged at this table, among these decision-makers, these executives who seemed to have everything under control. Evelyn straightened in her chair, ignoring the residual stickiness of spilled coffee on her blouse. She would get through this meeting. She had to. The door opened. A sudden shift rippled through the room. It was subtle, but undeniable. The way backs straightened, the way murmured conversations fell into silence. It was a reaction that could only be inspired by one thing: authority. Evelyn, still scanning her notes, noticed the change but didn't immediately look up. She was too focused on her strategy for the meeting. She needed to be sharp, composed. But then, something unsettled her. The air felt different, heavier, the faintest shuffle of movement. The way the CFO rose to his feet with a formality she had never seen from him before. The soft scrape of chairs as every executive in the room stood as well. A show of respect so instinctive, so immediate, that it sent a chill down her spine. She slowly lifted her gaze. And that's when her entire world stopped. Standing in the doorway, effortlessly composed, was the man from the cafe. But he was no cafe worker. He was Jonathan Reeves, the CEO. The weight of realization hit her like a wrecking ball. Everything from the morning, the hushed whispers, the lingering stares, the unspoken tension in the cafe, it all made sense now. The way he had stood there, watching her as she barked out her coffee order. The way he had let her shove money into his hand without a word, his expression unreadable. The money. She had given money to the CEO. A flush of heat burned up her neck, spreading like wildfire. The CFO's voice rang out, cutting through the thick, suffocating silence. "Everyone, please welcome Mr. Jonathan Reeves." Our company's CEO Evelyn's stomach plummeted. She couldn't move. The oxygen in the room suddenly felt too thin, her limbs too heavy, as if she had been pinned to her chair by sheer mortification. Jonathan stepped further inside, his movements slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room was on him, but his gaze was on her. Dark, unreadable, calculated. His expression was calm, professional, except for one detail. The faintest hint of amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth. A smirk. Not overt, subtle. But there. He was enjoying this. The room was too quiet, too aware. Everyone sensed something was happening. They just didn't know what. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice smooth, composed, yet unmistakably edged with something deeper. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his tone carrying a quiet satisfaction. She knew what was coming before he even said it. "We meet again." The words landed like a hammer. A slow murmur drifted through the room as executives exchanged glances. Evelyn sat rigid, her hands clenched beneath the table. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to disappear, to shrink into the polished leather chair, to fade into the air, to be anywhere but here. She forced herself to stay still, to keep her breathing steady, but she could feel it. The anticipation in the air, the weight of dozens of curious gazes flicking between her and the CEO. He knew. Of course, he knew. And he was savoring this moment. She could still see it. The way his fingers had curled around the cash she had shoved at him. How he had let it sit in his palm, untouched, before slipping it into his pocket with a smirk she had been too rushed to register. Her stomach twisted. What was he going to do? Would he call her out in front of everyone? Would he make a joke at her expense? Would he fire her? She didn't know which option was worse. The seconds stretched, taut with tension, before Jonathan finally turned away from her, shifting his focus to the rest of the room. The executives released a collective breath. Evelyn barely exhaled. The meeting had only just begun. But for her, it was already a disaster. And the worst part? It wasn't over yet. The moment the meeting ended, Evelyn felt her body uncoil, but only slightly. The weight of anxiety pressed against her ribs, refusing to let her breathe properly. She had survived the meeting, but at what cost? Executives gathered their papers, chairs scraped against the polished floor, and quiet conversations filled the space as people filed toward the exit. The meeting had been nothing more than routine for them. For Evelyn, it had been a slow, torturous unraveling of everything she thought she knew about her job, her confidence, and her future. She remained seated, her notebook open in front of her, but she hadn't written a single word. She couldn't even remember what had been discussed. All she could recall was his presence. Jonathan Reeves had said nothing more to her during the meeting. No direct remarks, no sly comments, no pointed glances. But that somehow made it worse. The silence was its own form of torment. It gave her nothing to hold on to, nothing to prepare for, and that terrified her. The last few executives murmured polite goodbyes as they left, but Evelyn's legs refused to move. She didn't trust them to carry her out of the room without collapsing beneath the sheer weight of embarrassment still clinging to her like a second skin. And then she realized. He hadn't left. Jonathan Reeves remained standing at the head of the table, his movements unhurried, effortless, as if the day was proceeding exactly as he had planned. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, a small, absent-minded motion, but it carried a weight of authority that Evelyn felt deep in her bones. This man was in control, always. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to exert dominance, because he already had it. She willed herself not to fidget, but the air felt heavier now. Too thick, too charged. The sound of her own pulse was deafening. Then he spoke. Calm, measured, unbothered. "Congratulations, Miss Evelyn." The words made her spine snap straight. Her throat went dry. She wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. The moment stretched unbearably as he casually buttoned his jacket, then, finally, lifted his gaze to hers. Something flickered there. Amusement? Interest? No A-game. A slow, deliberate setup. She didn't like the way he looked at her. Not with anger, not with disdain, but with a quiet curiosity, like a chess player studying his opponent's next move. Her voice barely worked when she finally forced out, "What?" He took a step forward, just enough to make her feel the shift in power. "Starting today, he said, the hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "You'll be my personal assistant." The words landed with the force of a hammer. Her pulse stalled. Her mind went blank. She blinked once, twice, waiting for some kind of follow-up, some clarification that would make this nightmare less real. None came. He wasn't joking. No hint of sarcasm, no trace of exaggeration. It was a statement, a decision, one that had already been made. Her fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair, knuckles turning pale. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She had spent the entire meeting bracing herself for public humiliation, for disciplinary action, for anything that would make sense. But this? This was calculated. A punishment, but not in the way she had expected. It was so much worse. She felt the words before she spoke them, heavy and dry in her throat. "You're punishing me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Jonathan merely raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying nothing but an easy amusement, as if he found her reaction entertaining. "Not at all," he replied smoothly, voice deceptively casual. The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. Not a smile, but something far more dangerous. "This is just..." A pause, a deliberate hesitation, just to watch her squirm. "Character development." The phrase made something cold settle in her chest. A shiver crawled up her spine. Her hands curled into tight fists beneath the table. She wanted to protest, to fight back, to demand an explanation. But she didn't. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. This wasn't up for discussion. It was a lesson, a test. And she had no choice but to play along. Her fate had already been sealed, and Jonathan Reeves was going to enjoy every second of it. The corporate world had its challenges, tight deadlines, high-stakes negotiations, the constant demand for perfection. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared Evelyn for what it meant to be Jonathan Reeves' assistant. It was like trying to juggle fire while blindfolded. From the moment she stepped into his office, the day spiraled into chaos. She had barely sat at her new desk when the first disaster struck, bringing him the wrong reports, not once, twice. The first time she had hurried to his office, reports clutched tightly in her arms, determined to at least pretend she had everything under control. Jonathan took them without comment, flipping through the pages with the same calm, unreadable expression he always wore. Then, without lifting his gaze, he simply set them down on his desk, fingers tapping idly against the surface. A pause, a quiet, almost too casual statement. "These are last quarter's reports." Her stomach dropped. Heat rushed up her neck, but before she could offer a single word of defense, he held up a hand, silencing her. "Try again," he said smoothly. The second time, she triple-checked before marching back in, this time certain she had brought the correct documents. Only to have him glance at the front page and say, without an ounce of emotion, "These are the market analysis files, not the financial reports." She nearly dropped dead on the spot. Her pride had barely recovered when the next catastrophe struck. While reaching for a folder, her elbow caught the edge of a glass of water sitting precariously on the corner of his desk. Time slowed. The glass tilted, wobbled, tipped. She lunged for it, but her fingers barely grazed the surface before the entire thing crashed forward, water spilling across the desk, racing toward the open laptop sitting just inches away. She gasped. Jonathan moved in a single fluid motion, snatching the laptop away just as the water reached the keyboard. A heavy silence hung between them. She froze, her breath trapped in her chest, eyes darting between the spreading pool of water and the man now watching her with the patience of someone who had just witnessed a train wreck in slow motion. She waited for the explosion, for the inevitable reprimand. Instead, a slow, measured sigh, a shake of the head. And then he pressed a single button on his desk phone. "Janet, bring a towel," he said, his voice calm, composed, almost amused. Evelyn wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. She rushed to grab napkins from the nearby coffee station, dabbing frantically at the mess, mumbling apologies that she knew wouldn't be enough. By the time the water was cleaned up, her hands were still shaking. But the worst mistake of the day had yet to come. Determined to make up for the disasters, she decided that at the very least she could bring him a proper coffee. It was a simple task, easy, foolproof. She took her time preparing it, measuring carefully, ensuring the perfect balance of bitterness and sweetness before carrying the mug back to his desk. Jonathan accepted it wordlessly, took a sip, and stopped. His brow lifted, his expression unreadable as he swallowed slowly, then glanced at the cup in his hand. Then, finally, a reaction, a thoughtful hum. "Interesting," he mused, rolling the taste over his tongue as if trying to analyze it. Evelyn stiffened. That wasn't a good interesting. That was an interesting that preceded some kind of disaster. He took another sip, his head tilting slightly as his gaze flicked back to her. "Tell me, Miss Evelyn." Her stomach twisted. "Are you trying to assassinate me?" Her entire body went rigid. The words struck her like a bolt of lightning, the weight of their absurdity colliding with her frayed nerves in the worst possible way. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. The only sound she managed was a strangled, horrified, "What?" He set the mug down, tapping a single finger against the rim, almost lazily. "This isn't coffee," he remarked, almost conversationally. "It's—" He paused, considering. "Something else entirely." The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She grabbed the cup, sniffed it, and instantly recoiled. Salt. She had poured salt instead of sugar. A full-body wave of mortification crashed over her. Jonathan simply leaned back in his chair, watching the sheer horror unfold across her face with the faintest glint of amusement. She couldn't even find the words. He chuckled. Actually chuckled. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "You're certainly keeping my day interesting," he said. His tone was too light, too entertained, as if this wasn't a complete and utter disaster, as if she wasn't moments away from resigning out of sheer humiliation. She wanted to argue, to insist it had been an honest mistake. But after flooding his desk and nearly sending him the wrong quarterly projections, Evelyn knew better than to dig herself into a deeper hole. She swallowed her pride, straightened her spine, and, without another word, turned on her heel and marched out of his office. Because if she stayed a second longer, she just might die of embarrassment. But the day wasn't over yet. Not even close. By the time Evelyn thought she could fade into the background, disappear into a quiet routine of damage control, and pray that Jonathan Reeves would forget she existed, fate had other plans. The moment she sat down at her desk, still reeling from her disastrous first day, a neatly printed memo landed in front of her. Her eyes skimmed the words, her stomach tightening with every syllable. A corporate gala. Tonight, attendance mandatory, and she was going as Jonathan Reeves' guest. The words might as well have been a death sentence. Her pulse stumbled over itself, panic creeping into her veins before her brain could fully process the implications. She was supposed to stand next to him? At a high-profile event? Where people would recognize him, analyze him, scrutinize every single thing about him, including his choice of company? She wasn't prepared for this. Not mentally, not emotionally, and certainly not fashionably, because she had nothing to wear. The mere thought of stepping into an elite, high-society event dressed in her usual office attire sent ice-cold dread down her spine. Before she could spiral any further, a box appeared on her desk. Jonathan, ever the enigma, had placed it there without a word, watching her reaction with the same detached amusement that had started to feel oddly familiar. Hesitantly, she lifted the lid, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside lay a gown. Not just any gown. A masterpiece of silk and satin, elegant yet understated, perfectly tailored to her frame as if someone had measured her without her knowledge. Her fingers hovered over the fabric, disbelieving. Her heart pounded louder than it should have. And for the first time she found herself completely, utterly speechless. The weight of Jonathan's presence pulled her gaze upward. He was watching her, expression unreadable, though there was something lurking behind his calm demeanor, something she couldn't quite place. When she finally managed to choke out a stunned, "Why?" he simply shrugged. His response was effortless, as if he hadn't just turned her world upside down with a single gesture. "I can't have my assistant looking out of place, can I?" There was no mockery in his voice, no teasing, just a statement of fact. And that, somehow, unsettled her even more. That evening, Evelyn found herself standing at the entrance of a world she did not belong to. The gala was held at an extravagant venue, a historic ballroom, its ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that reflected golden light across marble floors. Everywhere she looked, she saw powerful people. Men in tailored tuxedos, women in dazzling gowns, conversations flowing smoothly like well-rehearsed symphonies of influence and wealth. Jonathan, of course, fit in seamlessly. He was composed, commanding, the center of gravity in every interaction. And Evelyn? She was trying not to fall apart. The moment they stepped inside, heads turned, not just toward Jonathan, but toward her. Whispers followed in their wake, speculative glances, curiosity buzzing in the air. She felt exposed, like an imposter standing in a world that was never meant for her. But she barely had time to dwell on it, because that was when disaster struck. In a single miscalculated step, her heel caught on the plush carpet. A tiny stumble. Then, catastrophe. Evelyn reached out to steady herself, but her hand collided with something cold and fragile. A waiter holding a full tray of champagne flutes. The glasses wobbled, tilting dangerously. And then, in horrifying slow motion, the entire tray tipped forward. A cascade of golden liquid rained down onto Jonathan's impeccable suit. Time stopped. The room fell into an unnatural silence, a silence that stretched, hung. Everyone was staring. Someone gasped. Someone else barely stifled a laugh. Evelyn felt her soul leave her body. This was it, the moment she would be erased from existence. No job, no reputation, just a woman who had single-handedly humiliated the most powerful man in the room in front of dozens of witnesses. Her lungs refused to function. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her gaze flickered to Jonathan, bracing for the inevitable. A sharp reprimand, a glare that could freeze over hell itself, anything that signaled the end of her short-lived career. But he didn't yell. He didn't scowl. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he laughed, not a forced chuckle, not a barely contained sigh of frustration, a genuine, deep, amused laugh, a laugh that sent shockwaves through the room. And when he finally looked at her, there was no anger in his expression. Only mischief. "Well," he mused, shaking champagne droplets from his sleeve, "you certainly know how to make an entrance." Evelyn stood there, frozen, drenched in second-hand humiliation. And in that moment, there was only one thing she wanted more than anything else in the world. to disappear. Morning arrived with a cruel sense of inevitability. Evelyn had barely slept. The memory of the gala clung to her like an unforgiving shadow. The gasps, the whispers, the golden cascade of champagne soaking through Jonathan's perfectly tailored suit. She had spent the entire night battling between pure mortification and a growing sense of dread for what awaited her at work. She had thought, foolishly, that the worst was over. She was wrong. The moment she stepped into the office, she felt it. A shift in the air, an unnatural hush. People weren't just glancing at her. They were staring. Some whispered, their voices low but urgent, their gazes flicking toward her before quickly looking away. Others weren't even pretending to be subtle, scrolling through their phones, smirking, exchanging looks. A fresh wave of unease slithered down her spine. Something was wrong. She quickened her pace, nearly tripping over her own feet as she hurried toward her desk. Fumbling with her bag, she yanked out her phone, her fingers clumsy as she unlocked the screen. And then her entire world stopped. Her notifications were exploding. Hundreds, no, thousands of messages, tags, and news alerts. Her eyes scanned the words, her heartbeat stumbling over itself as she read the trending hashtags. Power couple CEO and assistant office romance. Evelyn's stomach dropped. No. This wasn't happening. Her trembling fingers scrolled further, searching for the source of this disaster. And then she saw it. A photograph. No, several photographs, splashed across multiple news outlets, gossip blogs, and viral Twitter threads. The images from last night's gala. Her breath hitched. There she was, standing beside Jonathan Reeves, dressed in the gown he had given her, his drenched suit still gleaming under the ballroom lights. And the angles. Oh, the angles. The way he had leaned in slightly, whispering some undoubtedly sarcastic remark in her ear. The way she had grabbed his arm, a desperate attempt to steady herself after tripping on the damn carpet. But to anyone looking at these photos, it didn't look like a disaster. It looked like a romance. The headlines were worse than she could have ever imagined. A spark at the gala? CEO Jonathan Reeves and his mysterious assistant steal the spotlight. Power moves or power couple? The internet is obsessed with this CEO love story. From the office to the ballroom, the chemistry between Jonathan Reeves and his assistant is undeniable. Evelyn felt her entire soul leave her body. This was a nightmare, a catastrophe, a public relations disaster, and she was right in the middle of it. A shadow fell over her desk. Even before she looked up, she knew. Jonathan. His presence was impossible to ignore. The air shifted, the scent of expensive cologne and quiet authority announcing his arrival before he even uttered a word. Slowly, dread filling every inch of her being, Evelyn lifted her gaze. And there he was. Tall, composed, every inch the CEO who never seemed rattled by anything. And worst of all, that infuriating smirk, that subtle, almost playful curve of his lips, as if the entire situation was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Like he was enjoying this. His arms were casually folded across his chest, the sharp cut of his navy suit still immaculate despite the chaos swirling around them. He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his sharp, calculating eyes. Famous already? His voice was low, smooth, unbearably calm. That was fast. Evelyn's jaw clenched, her fingers tightened around her phone, resisting the urge to throw it across the room. 1,000 responses ran through her mind, each one more furious than the last. But she didn't trust herself to speak. Not yet. Not when she was one breath away from either screaming or collapsing into a puddle of pure embarrassment. And just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, A new notification popped up on her screen. A breaking news update, another headline. Her blood ran cold as she read it. CEO Jonathan Reeves and his assistant, secret lovers? Exclusive inside scoop. Evelyn nearly blacked out. And Jonathan? He chuckled. Actually chuckled. Because for him, this was entertainment. For her, this was the beginning of hell. The air in the office had felt heavy all morning, thick with curiosity and unspoken gossip. Evelyn could feel it in the way her co-workers stole glances at her, in the way hushed conversations would stop whenever she walked by, only to resume the second she was out of earshot. She had convinced herself that it couldn't possibly get worse. She was wrong. At exactly 10:42 a.m., the elevator doors slid open. And that's when the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A woman stepped out, and the entire energy of the room shifted. Charlotte Reynolds. She moved with an air of unshakable confidence, her posture impossibly straight, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors like a countdown to impending doom. Her designer dress hugged her figure perfectly, the muted champagne color so effortlessly elegant that it somehow made Evelyn feel underdressed despite wearing business formal. Her platinum blonde hair was immaculate, her makeup flawless in a way that suggested she had been sculpted rather than born. There was something about her presence that demanded attention, not in an overly dramatic way, but in that cold, effortless manner of someone who always knew they were the most important person in the room. She didn't need to look around. She already knew exactly who she had come for. Evelyn felt it before it happened. That sharp, calculated gaze locking onto her. A predator spotting its target. The office went eerily silent. Phones kept ringing, emails kept flooding inboxes. But no one moved. No one breathed. Even the interns, who normally barely paid attention to office politics, were suddenly glued to their screens, pretending to work, but listening intently. The slow, deliberate steps of Charlotte's stilettos against the floor might as well have been gunshots in the eerie quiet. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, lips curling into a smirk that wasn't really a smirk at all. It was something far more dangerous. A warning. So. The word was spoken with a lazy kind of amusement, yet Evelyn felt it like a knife sliding between her ribs. Charlotte let the silence stretch, dragging out the moment like a cat toying with its prey. "You're the one everyone's talking about." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even an accusation. It was a statement of fact. A declaration of war. Evelyn's pulse spiked. She could feel every muscle in her body tensing, as if her own survival instincts were screaming at her to run. But she didn't move. She wouldn't. She refused. Even though her palms were damp, her throat dry, her mind racing for the right response. She had barely opened her mouth, hadn't even thought of what to say, when another shift in the air occurred. A presence, a familiar one, a dangerous one, Jonathan. He hadn't announced his arrival. He never needed to. He simply appeared, stepping into the moment as if he had owned it from the very beginning. And suddenly, everything felt different. The weight of the conversation had shifted, the balance of power altered. Charlotte's gaze flickered just for a second. But it was enough. She had expected Evelyn to be alone. She hadn't expected Jonathan to interfere. His presence wasn't loud. It was controlled, measured, dangerous. He stood with his hands casually tucked into his pockets, his dark eyes unreadable, his tailored suit pristine, despite the absolute chaos that surrounded them. And then, he spoke. "What are you doing here, Charlotte?" There was no warmth, no nostalgia, just a simple, blunt question. The office held its collective breath. Charlotte's lips twitched upward, but her smirk didn't reach her eyes this time. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, searching for a weakness, an opening. But Jonathan gave her nothing. No indication that he was affected by her presence. No sign that her visit had any power over him, so she adjusted, shifted gears. Because if she couldn't rattle him, she would rattle the girl. Her gaze slid back to Evelyn, assessing, calculating. "Just checking," she said smoothly, "to see if this little relationship is actually real." Silence, a beat too long, and Evelyn's stomach dropped because Jonathan didn't respond, didn't deny it, didn't say anything at all. And that silence was the loudest thing in the room. Charlotte's smirk deepened, like she had already won, like she knew something Evelyn didn't. And that was when Evelyn realized. This was no longer just an office rumor, this was a game. And she was losing. The room was a battlefield of silence. No one moved. No one even breathed. The tension was suffocating, coiling through the air like an unseen force, tightening its grip around Evelyn's chest. She wasn't sure what she hated more. The way Charlotte stood there, so effortlessly poised and in control, or the way Jonathan had yet to say a single word. That silence was killing her. The kind that stretched too long, the kind that made people draw their own conclusions, the kind that gave Charlotte exactly what she wanted. And then, the final blow. Charlotte tilted her head, her voice light, almost amused. "This is obviously fake," she mused, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the edge of her handbag. "Unless, of course, you can prove me wrong." She let the words linger, like poison dissolving into water, slow and lethal. The weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressed against Evelyn's skin, judging, expecting, waiting for the moment she cracked. She felt the heat rising to her face, her thoughts a blur of panic and disbelief. How had things spiraled out of control so fast? How had she gone from being a nobody in this company to being the center of a scandal that shouldn't even exist? She wanted to speak, to deny it, to laugh it off, to say something. But before she could, something else happened. Something she never saw coming. Jonathan moved, fast, decisive. 1 second, he was standing beside her, silent, unreadable. The next, he was closing the space between them. She barely had time to register the shift in the air, the heat of his presence before she felt his hand slide around her waist. Firm, unyielding. And then, his lips were on hers. The world ceased to exist. Gasps echoed across the office, the kind of collective shock that rippled through the space like a stone, shattering the still surface of a lake. The weight of the moment slammed into her all at once, the way his hand pressed against the small of her back, holding her in place. The way his lips moved against hers. Not hesitant, not cautious, but with a certainty that left her completely, utterly unmoored. Her pulse roared in her ears. Everything blurred, the walls, the people, the murmurs of disbelief and curiosity. For those few impossible seconds, there was only him. Only the scent of his cologne. Dark, expensive, intoxicating. Only the strength in the way he held her. Like he had meant every second of this. And that was the most dangerous part. Because for a moment, just a single, fleeting moment, she forgot. She forgot that this wasn't real. She forgot that it was just a reaction, just a move in a game she never agreed to play. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. Jonathan pulled away, his expression calm, effortless, like he hadn't just shattered every rational thought in her mind. He turned back to Charlotte, his voice smooth, completely unfazed. "Does that answer your question?" The office was dead silent. Evelyn? She wasn't breathing. Her mind had gone completely, absolutely blank. Charlotte, however, wasn't nearly as stunned. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers clenched around her bag. For the first time since stepping into that room, Her confidence faltered. She had expected a fight. She hadn't expected to lose. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something. A final strike, a last-ditch effort. But there was nothing left to say. She turned on her heel, her movements sharp, controlled, and stormed out of the office without another word. The second she disappeared, chaos erupted. Whispers, gasps, the buzz of disbelief crackling through the air like electricity. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of it all, eyes wide, mind blank. She felt the heat of 100 stares, the weight of a story that would spread like wildfire, impossible to contain. And then, she turned to Jonathan. He was still standing there, still collected, unreadable, still watching her. And he smiled, like he had just won. Like he had known exactly what he was doing all along. Evelyn? She was going to kill him. The office had long since emptied. The once bustling space, alive with ringing phones and hurried footsteps, had fallen into silence, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of papers left forgotten on desks. Through the massive glass windows, the city stretched endlessly below, a constellation of golden streetlights and neon reflections bouncing off rain-slicked pavement. Cars weaved through the night, honking impatiently, a distant murmur against the otherwise stillness inside. Evelyn stood near the window, arms crossed so tightly against her chest it almost hurt. The chill of the glass seeped through the thin fabric of her blouse, grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, still breathing. Even if her pulse told a different story. She had spent the entire day avoiding him. Emails, reports, meetings, anything to keep herself busy, anything to stop the memory from replaying in her mind. The collective gasp of the office, the way his hand had curled around her waist, firm but effortless, the way time had stretched, an eternity packed into those impossible few seconds. But the worst part? It wasn't the office gossip. It wasn't the whispers or the stolen glances from her co-workers. It wasn't even Charlotte's venomous smirk, laced with something between amusement and jealousy. It was him, the way he had looked at her afterward, unshaken, unapologetic, almost as if he had known what he was doing long before it even happened. And now, here she was, drawn into his orbit once again. Jonathan sat behind his desk, his silhouette half illuminated by the warm glow of his desk lamp. He looked as composed as ever, one arm draped lazily along the edge of his chair, the other adjusting the sleek cuff of his tailored suit. A man who was never unsettled, never out of control. Unlike her. The silence between them stretched, thick and unspoken, until she finally exhaled, sharp and unsteady. Tell me the truth. Her voice didn't waver, but it took everything to keep it steady. Jonathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers, studying her the way a master chess player would assess his opponent. Calculated, deliberate. The slow flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, something deep and quiet and impossible to decipher. Evelyn swallowed. She hated that look. Hated how it made her feel exposed, like he could see right through her carefully constructed walls, straight into the storm brewing beneath. Seconds passed, thick with something unnamed. Then, finally, no one word, heavy, absolute, but it wasn't enough. She felt the frustration bubble up, pressing against her ribs like something tangible. Then why? She demanded, voice tight. Why did you do it? A pause, the kind that made her stomach drop. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, considering her, not in amusement, not in challenge, but as if we... And then, softer this time, so soft she almost missed it. I did it because I wanted to. The air shifted. Something inside her stilled. No smirk, no teasing remark, no well-crafted excuse to throw her off balance. Just the truth. His gaze held hers, unwavering, stripped of the usual barriers he so effortlessly hid behind. And for the first time since she had met him, he wasn't pretending. Evelyn's breath caught. Because if he wasn't pretending, then this, whatever it was real. The realization settled over her like a weight, pressing against her chest, tightening around her lungs. She had spent so much time convincing herself this was nothing, that he was just another arrogant CEO playing a game she refused to be a part of. But now? Now she wasn't so sure, because Jonathan Reeves was many things, calculating, composed, unreadable. But in this moment, he was none of those things. He was just a man who had kissed her, not out of strategy, not to prove a point, but because he wanted to. And that terrified her more than anything. Because if he wanted this, then maybe, just maybe. So did she. The weeks that followed were a slow dance, a symphony of unspoken words and stolen moments. It was in the way his gaze lingered a second too long when she walked into a room, the way his voice softened, just slightly, when he spoke her name, the way their fingertips would brush, light as a whisper, across the edge of a file, a coffee cup, a shared silence too delicate to break. Evelyn tried to tell herself it was nothing, that the warmth curling in her chest when their eyes met was simply habit, not hope. That the way his presence anchored her, even on the hardest days, was convenience, not comfort. That the restless ache that filled the space between them was just circumstance, not longing. But lies, no matter how carefully built, always crack. And Jonathan, he had already stopped pretending. Tonight, the truth would no longer wait. The city shimmered beyond the vast glass windows of his office, an endless sea of golden lights stretching toward the horizon. Inside, the silence was almost sacred, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock, marking each breath, each heartbeat, each moment they had left before everything changed. Jonathan stood by the window, hands tucked into his pockets, his broad shoulders tense, as if holding back something uncontainable. When he turned, the world tilted. Gone was the teasing glint in his eye, the smirk that always kept her at arm's length, the practiced charm of a man who never let anyone too close. Instead, there was only him. Raw, unfiltered, certain. I don't care about the rumors. His voice was steady, unwavering, yet laced with something deeper, something that made her pulse stutter. I just care about you. Evelyn's breath hitched. Every part of her screamed to turn away, to protect herself from the sheer gravity of what this meant. But she didn't move, because for the first time, she didn't want to. Jonathan took a step forward, slow, intentional, the space between them disappearing. So what do you say, Evelyn? His voice dipped lower, rich as velvet, every syllable laced with quiet intensity. No contracts, no games, just us. It would be so easy to run, to let fear win, to retreat into the safe, predictable world she had built. But the safest choices had never made her heart race. She looked at him, the man who had challenged her, unraveled her, seen her in ways no one else ever had. And then she smiled, a real, unguarded, breathtakingly honest smile, and before doubt could steal the moment, she whispered the one word that changed everything. Yes,